Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hello and welcome to the State of the Economy podcast. I'm Jyothi Datta. An updated code defining the fine line between doctors and drug makers was recently issued by the Department of Pharmaceuticals. The UCPMP, as it's called, or the Uniform Code for Pharmaceutical Marketing Practices 2024, it pretty much outlines a framework within which pharma companies engage with doctors, but with guardrails to prevent these interactions from becoming some sort of an inducement to push drug prescriptions or an endorsement of some sort. But will it be successful in actually preventing freebies that masquerade as, product linked or educational material? To dissect this further, we have Varsha Rajesh, Pharmaceutical and Life Sciences lawyer with Nishith Desai Associates. So thank you, Varsha, for being here today.
Thank you, Jyothi. My pleasure.
So this updated ethical code, it comes about 10 years since the last one in 2015. What would you say are the key takeaways?
Yeah, so in terms of where we are at with respect to pharmaceutical marketing laws and government guidance, there are several moving pieces, Jyothi. So essentially, since 2015 and even before that, we have certain laws that have applied to doctors, and then we have certain set of laws that have applied to the pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies. So essentially, this framework, the UCPMP framework, is something that applies to the industry as a whole. And whereas with respect to doctors, there are certain ethical codes which have governed the manner in which doctors can interact with the industry. So when we look at the changes in this new 2024 code, it needs to be looked at holistically in terms of how the laws governing doctors have also evolved. And largely a clear pattern that we're seeing is that the intention of the government is to provide more guidance and, to step in and regulate more forms of collaborations and marketing activities that take place between doctors and the industry collectively. And the changes in the 2024 code is also in line with some of these patterns that we've been seeing from a regulatory perspective. So very broadly, some of the key points that have been clarified by way of the 2024 code since the last code that was issued almost a decade ago is that there's guidance pertaining to brand reminders and continuing medical education and certain forms of research and support that's provided by the pharmaceutical industry, as well as certain key points on provision of free samples to doctors itself. So just to quickly walk you through each of these changes one by one. The first being brand reminders. Previously, there wasn't a lot of guidance both under the laws governing doctors as well as under the UCPMP pertaining to brand reminders. But the new law, in fact, its new UCPMP 2024 legitimizes some of the approaches that have been taken by the government as well as income tax authorities pertaining to brand reminders, and essentially lays down that brand reminders, which could be in the form of diaries, calendars, journals, or e-journal subscriptions, should be lesser than 1,000 rupees in value. And while they are not prohibited, they companies should essentially ensure that any material that they provide in the form of brand reminders are indeed informational and educational in nature, and it cannot be something that's very extravagant. And similarly, along the same lines, with respect to provision of free samples, while there was guidance previously, there's certain additional guidance which have been introduced by way of this new code. And essentially what the 2024 UCPMP says is that there's a limitation in terms of how many samples that can be provided to each HCP. So each HCP can only be provided a 12 sample pack. And that is again for just 3 patients. And in addition to that, there are certain recording requirements. The details of the HCP which is receiving these free samples should also be recorded. And again, companies should also keep in mind that the total value of the samples that they provide to healthcare professionals in a year should not exceed 2% of the domestic sales of the company in India. And again, the sampling provisions also reiterate that, if there are certain tax deductions that are applicable, then the same should be done. And essentially, it requires that both the provision of samples to doctors as well as the receipt of samples by doctors should be in accordance with tax laws. And again, moving on with respect to continuing medical education, essentially, conducting seminars or any sort of promotional activities in the form of educating doctors should be in line with the 2024 UCPMP. And again, it's very clear in terms of the fact that there will be certain guidelines within which companies will have to operate in terms of providing CME programs. And in addition, there's also an explicit prohibition that such programs cannot be conducted in a location outside India. And again, the CME can also be conducted by hospitals or universities, associations, and research institutions. There's no prohibition on that. And companies may also collaborate with such bodies in order to conduct a CME. And another key point with respect to CME is that there are certain transparency requirements that the industry has to comply with. To this extent, they will have to publish the expenditure details and the details of the CME on their websites to ensure that the general public as well as the government is aware of the same. And again, in terms of support for any research or any collaborative research that companies are doing with healthcare professionals, they must ensure that any of this form of research is in line with certain guidelines and laws that are applicable to biomedical and health research in India. And to this extent, over the past couple of years, we've been moving towards a more stringent regulatory regime for governing clinical trials and biomedical research. So
Right.
any research that is conducted from this perspective should also have adequate permissions and approvals from the government. And again, if there is some
So,
sort of support that's,
yes, you brought in a lot of points there. I just wanted to pick up on one or two of that points that you pointed out. Now, you did mention continuing medical education. So this is something that earlier was being supported through the associations. Now, CMEs are, conferences where doctors are updated on new technologies and new drugs and all of that. So um, at one point it was all directed through, industry could support the association. So how is it being framed now, and will it actually succeed in letting a conference be a conference and not become a family holiday or a cruise trip and things like that, which is what the UCMP PMP has also sort of alluded to?
Yeah, so there are again two ways to look at it. So from a doctor's perspective, doctors are in fact mandated to, attend CME programs and, receive and further their education as well as receive training on products. So from the perspective of the UCPMP 2024, certain key points that companies need to keep in mind is that all of these sort of workshops and seminars and conferences should be conducted within the guidance of certain verifiable set of guidelines or transparent guidelines which may be prescribed. Again, it's not very clear whether these have to be self-adopted guidelines or this is something that industry associations or the Department of Pharmaceuticals itself will be prescribing. And that is one key point to keep in mind in terms of where the UCPMP 2024 is headed. And again, with respect to permissibility of certain of these kinds of educational activities, essentially hospitals, universities, and associations of doctors and medical colleges, all of these set of people can conduct CME educational programs. And if companies want to independently conduct CMEs, there is no prohibition on that as well. But alternatively, if they want to collaborate with these bodies, that should also be fine. And again, irrespective of the nature of collaboration or independent programs that have been conducted, pharmaceutical companies should share the details of all of these events on their website. So in terms of the details that's required to be disclosed, the government essentially wants to make sure that all of the expenditures that have been incurred, are being put up on the websites from like an audit perspective, because they want to ensure that it's reasonable in nature and it's not highly extravagant.
Right.
And
That way there is more transparency is what you're pointing out to. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And
Right.
another key point to keep in mind really is that any sort of CME cannot be conducted in a location outside India. So essentially, if at all a pharmaceutical industry body, or, if a company wants to conduct some sort of a program in like a foreign location or like a cruise, this should not be permissible, because essentially the government wants to limit these kind of programs to, being educational in nature and not being in the, domain of being extravagant
True.
or promotional in nature.
True. True. So is this code a continuation in a sense of, the tax tightening on freebies that we saw, I think, in mid 2022?
Yeah. So, 2022 was a very important year for the industry in terms of the mega Supreme Court judgment that was issued. And in addition to that, the tax department also came up with certain guidelines or with respect to how tax should be withheld while providing, remuneration to doctors, or while providing samples to doctors. And the third major development that really happened in 2022 is that there were amendments that were made to the tax law itself, by virtue of which companies were not permitted to avail deductions for any expense that could be in violation of the UCPMP or the MCI code. So again, if we look at the UCPMP 2024, there's a lot of reference that's been made to requirement of compliance with tax laws. And this is again twofold, right? So in terms of how the company should look at it, a lot of their marketing expenditures will not be permitted for deductions under tax laws, or, some sort of a tax benefit, if at all they're, viewed to be as non-compliant with the UCPMP 2024. And the second limb to this is that if they're providing some sort of a benefit to a healthcare professional in the nature of providing free samples, or even if it's providing consultancy fees for like research, or some sort of like a consultancy agreement that they have with the doctor, then in that case also they will have to ensure that they're deducting tax at source before they're providing this kind of a remuneration to the doctor itself. And another key important point to keep in mind from a tax perspective is that brand reminders, essentially diaries, calendars, journals, and subscriptions to online journals, should all be within the permissible limit of 1,000 rupees. So again, if companies are not compliant with this monetary limit, then they could be disallowed from availing any sort of a tax benefit.
Right. Very interesting. So, I've been talking to people both from the industry and doctors as well, and even civil society. Now, is there, a whistleblower kind of tone to this code in that anyone can complain and the company top management would need to look into it thereafter? But the what do you say? The downside there being that the complainer will have to pay, I think, 1,000 rupees or so. Will that payment be a put off, you think?
Yeah, so I wouldn't go so far as to say that it would be a whistleblower, it'll have some sort of like a whistleblower effect, but definitely the UCPMP 2024 expressly recognizes individuals as well as companies as being complainants. So essentially, if anybody today, including you or I, find or discover a non-compliance to the UCPMP, and if at all we want to initiate some sort of an action, then it seems to be welcome. And again, something to keep in mind is that the complainant, yes, of course, there's a fee attached to making a complaint. In addition to that, the details of the complainant has to be disclosed. So it's not that, you drop in an anonymous message or you drop in an anonymous letter. There should be full disclosure with respect to your contact details as well as your name and maybe even your credentials. So again, from that perspective, that is something that we need to keep in mind. And the complaint again has to be made to the association or the industry body that the company is a part of. So it is not something, it's not a court proceeding or some sort of a complaint that's initiated with a regulatory authority, but the first step is that the complaint can be made to the industry association.
Right, and so that, you sort of said it there, which is also the part of the criticism that the code is drawing, in that the industry sits in judgment of itself. So in that sense, will there really be, a fair investigation of whatever the complaint is? So you think there needs to be someone outside, or a multiple membered body with more other voices, maybe NGO voices or civil society and others, to look into complaints like this, or some sort of an ombudsman?
Yeah, so this is actually a two-step process. So they've carried the previous version of the UCPMP forward in terms of the process itself. So if we look at it as a first step, if you are a complainant, then a complaint has been lodged with the industry association. And then, in terms of your satisfaction with the first decision that's provided by the industry association, there's an appeals mechanism that's been contemplated. So if at all you're preferring an appeal, be it either the company or the complainant itself, then in that case, the appeal will lie with the government. So essentially, the Secretary of the Department of Pharmaceuticals will proceed over the appeals mechanism and will provide a judgment. So in terms of the entire process itself being biased, yes, to an extent, at the first step itself, you do not have an unbiased party which might be presiding over the complaint. But if at all an appeal has been preferred, then you do have that comfort that it's the government which is going to be delving into this. And again, from the perspective of enforcement itself, this has been a vast improvement in terms of how the previous version of the UCPMP was being enforced, because there wasn't a lot of regulatory intervention in that case. Whereas over here, what we do see is that there is increasing interest of the DOP to, step in and regulate, even in terms of the disclosure requirements. I mean, there's an entire audit mechanism that's also been contemplated. And again, in the appeals, we do see that the DOP does want to sit and preside over the appeals.
Yes, a lot more clarity on that, and even penalties and things that have been talked about. So this will be a space that we will keep an eye on, and as it gets implemented. With this, we bring this interaction to an end. Varsha, from the Business Line team and myself, thank you so much for your time and insights on the issue.
Thank you. My pleasure.